Welcome back, everybody. Today we're diving into some pretty deep waters. We're looking at Gianfranco Dalla Barba's memory, consciousness, and temporality.
Oh, an excellent choice.
It's going to be a fascinating deep dive. We're really looking at the philosophical underpinnings of how our minds work, especially when it comes to memory. So get ready to challenge some of those assumptions about how your mind operates, how it all works.
Yeah, and I think, for anyone out there who's ever wondered about the philosophy behind the science of cognitive science, this is the deep dive for you.
This is it, yeah. Dalla Barba really gets into some really interesting ideas right away, too. Like, right off the bat, he tackles this thing he calls the paradox of the memory trace. Have you ever thought about that? I mean, if memories are just, physical changes in the brain, like, how can we experience them as being in the past?
Right, right. And that's where he starts getting into this, how can something physical contain, like, the feeling of time?
Exactly.
It's like one of the analogies he uses is like a footprint in the sand.
Uh-huh.
It's like saying that a footprint in the sand that contains the past event of someone walking there. But, the footprint itself is just there in the present. The pastness is something that, we kind of bring to it.
That's how we experience it. Yeah, and he even takes this idea beyond just, like, remembering events. He talks about knowledge, too.
Oh, yeah.
Like, if you know that water is H2O,
Right.
where is that knowledge, like, stored? It doesn't seem like it's just this physical thing in your brain. It becomes part of your consciousness, right? And affects how you see the world.
Well, that's where he gets into one of the big traps that people fall into when they're trying to explain mental processes.
Yeah.
It's what he calls the homunculus fallacy. Like this idea that there's like a little person inside our heads who's doing the thinking, the remembering. But then, who's controlling that homunculus? It just pushes the question back, further and further.
It's like an infinite redress of these little people. So instead of this mini-me running the show, Dalla Barba is saying we need to understand consciousness is the foundation, right? Not just a product of these other processes.
And that's a radical shift in how we think about the mind.
It really is.
He uses this analogy. He says, thinking that seeing is just light hitting the retina. It's like thinking that being on top of a tower lets you see the countryside.
Okay.
The tower gives you a vantage point, but it doesn't explain the experience of seeing.
Ah, that's a good one.
Yeah.
So this is where it gets even wilder, I think. Dalla Barba says that a lot of what we think of as mental, like our memories, our beliefs, even how we perceive our bodies, are actually constructions of consciousness.
It's like almost like we're creating our own reality.
It's a very active process.
Yeah, exactly. And it challenges this idea, that our minds just passively record information.
Yeah.
He's saying that consciousness is actively shaping and interpreting our experiences. Yeah, think about it. Think about like how much of what you think is in your head is actually shaped by how your consciousness interacts with the world around you.
Yeah, and he takes this idea to like our intentions.
Yeah.
He uses this example of someone deciding to run for president. Like that intention, it's not just a single thought.
Right.
It relies on a whole bunch of unconscious knowledge about elections, political systems, what it means to be president.
It's almost like there's a whole like web of understanding and knowledge that's feeding into that.
Yeah, this is where I think, Dalla Barba starts really pushing against this idea of materialist reductionism. This idea that we can reduce consciousness to just physical processes.
Yeah.
He's saying that leaves something crucial out, the subjective experience.
Right, and like he asks, even if we knew everything about how the brain worked, could we explain what it's like to see the color red?
Or feel pain.
Yeah, or experience love. These are qualities of experience that, go beyond the physical world.
And it's not just a, oh, well, we don't have enough data yet problem, right? He's saying it's a fundamental issue with confusing correlation. The fact that brain activity happens alongside mental states with causation.
Right.
It's not necessarily causing it.
Yeah, he wants us to see how consciousness is playing a role in shaping our reality.
And this brings us to one of the, I think, most fascinating parts of Dalla Barba's work, his view on consciousness and time.
Oh, yeah.
How they're related.
Yeah.
He says that, time isn't out there in the world the way we usually think of it. Instead, it's a fundamental aspect of how consciousness structures our experience.
It's how we experience it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Past, present, future, they're not just objective categories. They're ways our consciousness relates to events.
It's like our consciousness is like weaving time.
So remembering then isn't about retrieving a past trace. It's about consciousness actively reaching back and like reconstituting a past event in the present moment.
And he uses this really great analogy to explain this.
Oh, yeah?
He talks about a spotlight shining on different parts of a stage.
I like that.
And consciousness is that spotlight, illuminating different moments in time and making them present to us.
Okay, whoa, this is blowing my mind a little bit. So if our memories aren't just recordings, are we all just unreliable narrators of our own lives? Like, what do you think about that?
Well, that's a great question, and it kind of leads us to this other really interesting thing that Dalla Barba gets into, this phenomenon of confabulation.
Confabulation. Okay, now remind me, isn't that where, like, people with certain brain injuries create these, like, false memories, but they actually, like, genuinely believe them?
Exactly, yeah. And Dalla Barba uses this idea of confabulation to kind of challenge those traditional explanations of memory. He asks if these memories are just about like filling in the gaps, right? Why are they so often consistent with the person's existing knowledge and their beliefs about the world?
Huh. Okay, yeah, that's a good point.
Like he gives a really interesting example in the book. There was this patient who confabulated this memory of winning a race
Okay,
and getting a piece of meat as a
the
prize.
piece of meat. That's so specific.
Right, but when you look deeper, it actually kind of reflects things about his life. Like he was a runner, he loved running, and he had this old knee injury.
Mm, wow.
So even in confabulation, consciousness is trying to make this like coherent narrative, even when it's based on, kind of distorted or incomplete information.
So it's not just that, memory could be unreliable. What you're saying is that Dalla Barba is arguing that consciousness is like fundamentally creative, right? It's constantly weaving this narrative of our lives based on the info it's got.
And that raises these like really profound questions. Like if consciousness is the author, and not just the reader of our experience, what does that even mean for how we understand our own lives? What are the stories that we're telling ourselves? And how much control do we really have over them?
I mean, that's a big one, right? Are we just products of our brains, or do we have like agency to shape our own reality?
Yeah, and Dalla Barba, he doesn't offer any easy answers, and I think that's part of what makes his work so compelling. He's really inviting us to explore consciousness in this deeper way, to really question our assumptions about how our minds work and to consider, this possibility that we might be more than just biological machines.
I had to admit, I'm especially curious about this whole idea of temporality. Like how does our experience of time shape our memories and consciousness?
Well, that's really at the heart of Dalla Barba's work. He challenges this traditional view of memory as like, a passive storage system, like a filing cabinet or something.
Right, right. Like you just pull out the file labeled the first kiss and bam, there's the memory.
And Dalla Barba's saying, no, it's not that simple at all. He argues that memory is an active process that's intimately connected to our consciousness and our experience of time.
So it's more dynamic than just recruiting static information.
Much more dynamic, yeah. He actually starts by critiquing this whole idea of a memory trace. This notion that memories are like physically stored in the brain as like these, distinct traces.
Okay, so like specific neurons hold specific memories.
Yeah, and Dalla Barba's like, well, how can a physical trace in the present really represent something from the past? Like, how can the current state of a neuron, tell us about what happened yesterday or 10 years ago?
That's a good question.
Right, like the past is gone, so how can it be physically present in our brains?
So if it's not this simple file retrieval system, how does he explain how memory works?
Well, Dalla Barba suggests that, instead of retrieving static information, memory is more about how past experiences shape our present consciousness.
Okay, so it's less about the specific details and more about the overall impact.
And he uses this fascinating case study from Claperet to kind of illustrate this point.
Okay?
This patient with amnesia was pricked with a pin during an exam, right? And then the next day, she couldn't consciously recall the event at all.
Oh, wow.
But she hesitated to shake the doctor's hand.
Oh, that's interesting. So like some trace of the experience remained even though she didn't consciously remember it?
And that's precisely Dalla Barba's point. There's this difference between conscious recollection and the way that past experiences can shape our feelings and actions, often without us even realizing it.
Yeah, like a gut feeling.
Right, like our past is still influencing us even when we can't remember it directly. And Dalla Barba argued that to really understand consciousness, we need to move beyond these simple mechanical metaphors.
So how does he propose we think about consciousness then?
Well, he suggests that consciousness isn't just a product of the brain, like it's not just some kind of byproduct of neural activity.
Okay.
He says it's more like an active force that shapes our experience of the world.
I'm not sure I followed.
Okay, so think about our senses for a second. We tend to think about them as passively receiving information from the world, like our eyes just record images and our ears just pick up sounds.
Right.
But Dalla Barber is saying that consciousness actually actively engages with the world through our senses.
So our eyes don't just record images. It's our consciousness that's actually interpreting those images and creating our experience of seeing.
Precisely, consciousness is giving those images meaning and making them part of our reality.
Okay, I think I'm starting to get it. So it's not that the image on my retina is causing me to see. It's more like my consciousness is using my retina as a tool to engage with the world and create my visual experience.
It's like consciousness is shaping the world that we perceive.
So consciousness is more like an active participant in creating reality than a passive observer.
It's a pretty radical shift in perspective.
It really is. So if consciousness is actively shaping our reality, does that mean that our experiences are inherently subjective, rather than objective?
That's a key point that Dalla Barba makes. He argues that science, while it can explain the mechanisms of the brain, it can never fully capture the subjective feeling of what it's like to experience something.
So like science can tell us about the wavelengths of light that create the color red,
Right.
but it can't capture the feeling of seeing red, or the memories and emotions that it evokes.
It can't quantify the subjective quality of experience.
Right, science can explain the how, but not the what it's like.
And that kind of brings us to another important concept that Dalla Barba outlines,
Which is?
the different types of consciousness.
Oh, okay. I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
He suggests that there are three main types, knowing consciousness, imaginative consciousness, and temporal consciousness.
3 types of consciousness.
Yeah, and each one plays a distinct role in how we experience the world and construct our reality.
Okay, well, let's break those down a little bit. What does he mean by knowing consciousness?
So knowing consciousness is about how we understand the world around us. It involves recognizing objects, categorizing them, and understanding their relationships, like building a mental model of how things work.
So it's like building a mental map of our world.
Yeah, exactly. But he's not just talking about memorizing facts or anything like that. It's more than that.
Okay, so there's more to it than just accumulating knowledge.
Right. Dalla Barba emphasizes that knowing consciousness is an active process of negation.
Negation.
Yeah, it's about recognizing what something is by also understanding what it is not.
I'm not sure I follow. Can you give me an example?
Sure. So imagine you see a cat, right?
Okay.
You recognize it as a cat because you understand that it's not a dog, it's not a bird, it's not a tree.
Right.
It's this process of differentiating, of drawing boundaries that allows us to define objects and concepts in our minds.
So it's not just about taking in information. It's about actively shaping and refining our understanding of the world through this process of comparison and contrast.
It's like we're constantly testing our understanding against the world and refining it based on what we learn.
That's fascinating. So knowing consciousness is laying the groundwork for how we understand reality. But what about this imaginative consciousness? Where does that fit in?
Well, imaginative consciousness allows us to go beyond the limits of our immediate perception. It's our ability to create mental images, envision possibilities, and can step outside the boundaries of the here and now.
So this is where creativity and possibility come into play.
Absolutely. It's the ability to imagine different futures, different outcomes, to explore alternative paths, to daydream, to create art, to invent.
Makes our minds can travel through time and explore different realities.
And it's a powerful force in shaping our experience and giving meaning to our lives.
I'm starting to see how these different types of consciousness are building on each other. We have knowing consciousness, establishing our understanding of the world,
Right.
and then imaginative consciousness, allowing us to step outside those boundaries and explore new possibilities.
Yeah, and then you bring in temporal consciousness, and that's where things get really interesting.
So temporal consciousness brings in the element of time, but how does that connect to memory?
Well, temporal consciousness is all about how we experience time, past, present, and future. And this is where memory plays a crucial role.
Okay.
Dalla Barber argues that memory isn't simply about retreating past events, but it's about actively placing those events within a temporal framework.
So instead of thinking of memories as like static files, he's suggesting that we're actually constructing a narrative of our past.
We're weaving together events and experiences into a timeline that makes sense to us.
And that narrative isn't fixed. It's constantly evolving as we gain new experiences and understanding.
Right, it's like we're constantly rewriting our personal histories.
That's a fascinating way to think about memory.
And this story, this narrative, is shaped by our temporal consciousness.
So how does this temporal consciousness play out in conditions like amnesia, where the ability to remember is impaired?
That's where things get really intriguing, and I think that's a perfect place to pick up in the next part of our deep dive.
So we've been talking about these different types of consciousness. Dalla Barba describes, knowing, imaginative, and temporal. But how does he actually tie them together when it comes to explaining memory, especially, in cases where memory is disrupted, like with amnesia?
That's a great question, and it's really where his framework, I think, shines. He uses amnesia not so much as like a loss of data, but as a breakdown in this temporal framework.
Okay, so less like missing files and more like losing the ability to organize those files chronologically?
Yeah, exactly. It's like losing the timeline, the narrative thread that connects our experiences.
So someone with amnesia isn't just forgetting specific events, they're actually losing the capacity to place those events within their overall life story.
Precisely. And this helps explain some of the, otherwise bizarre symptoms we see with amnesia, like confabulation.
And it's not that they're intentionally lying or anything, it's more like their brain is trying to fill in the gaps in their experience.
Dalla Barba gives some really striking examples. Like one patient who was hospitalized for weeks, insisted she was about to go to the market, even like planning how she'd get there.
Wow, so her brain was creating this whole scenario to make sense of her situation.
Yeah, these aren't deliberate deceptions. It's like their consciousness is trying to create a coherent narrative when the usual temporal anchors are missing.
So in a way, their imaginative consciousness is working overtime to bridge those gaps in their temporal consciousness.
I think that's a really good way to put it.
But if our experience of time is so fundamental to how we construct our reality, does that mean our memories are inherently unreliable? Like are we all just making things up as we go along?
Well, Dal Barba doesn't go that far. He argues that, memory isn't really about achieving perfect historical accuracy.
Right, it's not like a video recording.
It's more about creating a meaningful narrative. Our memories are shaped by our current understanding, our beliefs, our emotional states, all of that.
That makes sense. We don't experience time as like a series of isolated snapshots, right? It's a continuous flow, a story we're constantly telling ourselves.
Precisely. And like any good storyteller, we might emphasize certain events, downplay others, maybe even embellish a bit, to create a narrative that makes sense to us.
So our memories are less like objective records and more like subjective interpretations.
That's a good way to think about it. And Dalla Barba actually points out that remembering isn't just about accuracy. It's also about meaning making.
So a memory that might seem inaccurate from a purely factual perspective could still hold deep personal truth and significance.
It's about the meaning we give to our experiences.
This whole conversation's got me thinking, how we often treat memory as this fixed objective thing. We try to test it, measure it, quantify it, but maybe it's more fluid than that, more like, a river that's constantly shaping and reshaping the landscape it flows through.
That's a beautiful analogy. I love that. And just like a river carries traces of its journey, our memories carry traces of our experiences, our emotions, our evolving understanding of the world.
So if our memories are constantly being shaped by our present consciousness, does that mean we have the power to reshape them? Can we, in a sense, rewrite our past?
That's a fascinating question, and it's one that I think goes a bit beyond the scope of Della Barba's work. His focus is really on highlighting the dynamic and constructive nature of memory.
Okay, so he's not necessarily giving us like a how-to guide on memory manipulation?
No, but his work definitely challenges this notion of memory as a passive recording device. It seems like we have a lot more agency in shaping our memories than we might realize.
Okay, so we've been spending this deep dive really trying to unpack Dalla Barba's ideas about memory, consciousness, and temporality. And we've talked about these different types of consciousness, right? The knowing, the imaginative, and the temporal, and how they sort of interact. But there's this overarching theme of freedom that keeps like popping up. What exactly does Dalla Barba mean by this freedom of consciousness?
Yeah, it's a really complex idea. But essentially, Dalla Barba's arguing that if time isn't this external reality that's, totally separate from consciousness, but is actually like a structure within it, then, we might have more agency in how we experience and construct our reality than we typically assume.
Okay, I think I'm starting to get it. So it's not that we can like magically control time or, change the past or anything like that, right?
Right.
It's more about recognizing the active role that consciousness plays in shaping our perception of time and therefore, our experience of reality.
And think back to the different types of consciousness that we talked about,
Okay?
like knowing consciousness allows us to create this framework for understanding the world, right?
Right.
And then imaginative consciousness lets us explore all these possibilities beyond our immediate perception. And then temporal consciousness is how we organize our experiences within a temporal framework, right? Creating that narrative of our lives.
This has been like a seriously thought-provoking conversation. Dalla Barba's work really challenges us to to rethink some of these really fundamental assumptions about how our minds actually work. It's not just about the mechanics of memory, but about the active role of consciousness in shaping our experience of reality.
Yeah, and it really underscores how important it is to understand, these different facets of consciousness, the knowing, the imaginative, the temporal, and how they all work together to create meaning in our lives.
So what would you say is the key takeaway, that you hope our listeners walk away with today? Like, what's the one thing you'd want them to remember from this deep dive into Dalla Barba's work?
I think the most important takeaway is that memory isn't just, this passive repository of fact, right? It's an active process of meaning making. We have a lot more agency in shaping our memories and our narratives than we often realize, and that recognition can be incredibly empowering. By understanding this freedom of consciousness, we can free ourselves from these limiting beliefs, reframe our past experiences, and create a more authentic and fulfilling narrative for our lives.
That's a beautiful way to put it. I know I'm walking away from this conversation with a lot to ponder, and if our listeners are as intrigued by Dalla Barba's ideas as we are, you know, we encourage you to check out his book, Memory, Consciousness, and Temporality, for a more in-depth exploration of these fascinating concepts. And thanks for joining us on this deep dive. And until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep into the mysteries of the human mind.